Some moments change everything, and for Russel Parker, this was one of them. Outside a trading post in Montana, he found a little girl left alone in the rain, paralyzed, abandoned, with nowhere to go. She sat in an old wooden wheelchair, her bare feet muddy and cold, her clothes soaked through. Inside, people turned away when he asked whose child she was. Nobody wanted her. Russel was a mountain man who'd spent years running from his past, from the daughter he'd lost long ago. But something about this girl's quiet, empty stare reached straight into his broken heart. What makes a man leave his solitude behind to save a child the world has given up on? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Montana Territory in 1874 was a land of contradictions, breathtaking in its beauty, unforgiving in its nature. The mountains rose like ancient sentinels against skies so vast they seemed to swallow a man's thoughts whole. In the valleys between those peaks, where the pine forests grew dense and the creeks ran cold and clear, a person could lose themselves entirely. That was exactly what Russel Parker had intended when he came here 15 years ago. He'd been 42 then, a broken man fleeing memories that haunted every waking moment. Now at 57, his face was weathered like old leather, lined deep from squinting against mountain sun and wind. His beard, more grey than brown now, reached halfway down his chest. His hands were scarred and calloused from years of trap lines, wood splitting, and the thousand small violences required to survive alone in the wilderness. He stood just under 6 feet tall, lean and rangy, moving with the deliberate efficiency of someone who'd learned that wasted motion could mean the difference between comfort and suffering when you lived a day's hard ride from the nearest settlement. Russel's cabin sat in a high meadow surrounded by lodgepole pines, accessible only by a narrow trail that wound through granite outcroppings and across 2 creek crossings. He'd built it himself that first year, when grief had driven him to work from dawn until his hands bled, anything to exhaust himself enough to sleep without dreaming. The structure was solid, thick logs chinked with moss and clay, a stone fireplace that drew clean, a roof that had weathered 15 Montana winters without leaking. Inside it was spare but functional. A rope bed in one corner, a table and 2 chairs he'd made himself. Shelves for his few possessions, hooks for his traps and tools. Everything had its place. Everything served a purpose. He kept a small trunk beneath his bed, and in that trunk lay the only remnants of his former life. A worn leather journal filled with entries he could no longer bear to read. A woman's hair comb made of carved bone. A child's dress, carefully folded, still faintly smelling of lavender despite the years. And a tintype photograph in a tarnished silver frame. His wife Catherine, dark-haired and smiling, holding their daughter Emma in her lap. Emma had been 3 when that photograph was taken. She'd lived only 5 more years. Russel had been a carpenter in Pennsylvania, a good one. He'd owned a small shop in a town called Millerton, built furniture for the wealthy families in the area, lived in a tidy house with a white fence and a garden where Catherine grew roses. They'd been happy, genuinely, deeply happy, in the way that only people who've found their place in the world can be. Emma had been their miracle, arriving after Catherine had suffered 2 miscarriages that had nearly broken them both. When she'd finally carried a baby to term, when Emma had come into the world red-faced and squalling and perfect, Russel had wept with gratitude. Emma had been bright and curious, always asking questions, always into everything. She'd followed Russel around his workshop from the time she could walk, wanting to know how things were made, why wood grain ran the way it did, what made a joint hold strong. He'd made her small tools of her own, a tiny hammer, a miniature saw, and she'd worked beside him, her tongue poking out in concentration as she helped him build. He could still hear her laughter high and clear as bells. Could still feel her small hand tucked into his rough one as they walked to the general store. Catherine had died when Emma was 5. Complications from a difficult childbirth. The baby, a son, had been stillborn. The doctor, incompetent or simply unlucky, had been unable to stop the bleeding. Russel had held his wife's hand as she slipped away, her skin growing paler and colder despite his desperate grip. She'd made him promise to take care of their girl, to make sure Emma grew up knowing how much her mother had loved her. He'd promised. He'd meant it with everything in him. For 3 years after Catherine's death, Russel had done his best. He'd cooked Emma's meals and mended her dresses. He'd tucked her in at night and told her stories about her mother. He'd kept the shop running, though the joy had gone out of the work. The town's women had helped, bringing casseroles, offering to watch Emma, showing him how to braid her hair properly. He'd been grateful, but it had all felt like moving through deep water, every action requiring tremendous effort. Then scarlet fever had swept through Millerton in the winter of 1859. Emma had been 8 years old, small for her age, delicate. She'd caught it early in the outbreak. Russel had sat beside her bed for 6 days, sponging her burning forehead with cool water, holding her when the convulsions came, begging God or fate or whatever force governed the universe to take him instead. On the 7th day, she'd opened her eyes and looked at him with something approaching clarity. "Papa," she'd whispered, "don't be sad. I'm going to see Mama now." Those had been her last words. He'd buried her next to Catherine in the town cemetery, under an oak tree where she'd like to play. The headstone had read, "Emma Rose Parker, beloved daughter gone too soon." After the funeral, after the neighbors had stopped bringing food and offering condolences, after the terrible silence of his empty house had become unbearable, Russel had made his decision. He'd sold the shop, sold the house, sold or gave away everything he owned, except what would fit in a single trunk. He'd bought a horse, supplies, and a rifle, and he'd headed west with no destination in mind except away. The Montana Territory had welcomed him the way it welcomed all broken things, with indifference and challenge. The mountains didn't care about his grief. The winter didn't care about his loss. If he wanted to survive, he had to learn, had to adapt, had to become something other than what he'd been. So he had. He'd learned to trap beaver and marten, to read weather in the clouds, to move through the forest without sound. He'd learned which plants would heal and which would kill, where to find game in winter, how to preserve meat through the hot months. He'd learned to be alone. For 15 years, his life had followed a predictable rhythm. Spring through fall, he worked his trap lines, hunted, fished, and tended a small garden patch near his cabin. He smoked meat, tanned hides, gathered berries and roots, and prepared for winter. Every 3 months or so, he'd make the 2-day journey down to Thornhill Trading Post to sell his furs and buy supplies: salt, flour, coffee, ammunition, the few manufactured goods he couldn't make or do without. He'd spend one night at the trading post, sleeping in the small room Samuel Thornhill kept for trappers, then head back to his mountain solitude. The trading post itself was a substantial log structure that served as the hub for scattered settlers and trappers across a 100-mile radius. Samuel Thornhill, a former fur trader himself, had built it 20 years earlier when his knees had given out and he'd decided to let other men do the ranging while he minded the store. He was in his 60s now, barrel-chested and white-bearded, with shrewd eyes that missed little. His wife Martha was a practical woman with strong hands and a kind heart, though she maintained a careful distance from most of the rough men who frequented the post. The couple had no children of their own, a sadness that sometimes showed in Martha's eyes when families came through. Samuel had always treated Russel with respect, never prying into his past, never asking why a man with education and skill had chosen such isolation. Over the years, a quiet friendship had formed between them, built on fair dealing and mutual understanding. Samuel knew good work when he saw it, and Russel's furs were always prime, well stretched and properly cured. They'd share a drink and a pipe in the evenings during Russel's visits, talking about weather and game movements and the slow changes coming to the territory as more settlers pushed west. The trading post drew its share of characters: trappers and hunters, rough men who lived hard and died young, settlers passing through looking for land to claim, their wagons loaded with hope and furniture, occasional prospectors wild-eyed with gold fever. native people from the nearby Salish tribes, coming to trade furs and beadwork for metal tools and cloth. Samuel treated everyone fairly, and as a result, the trading post remained neutral ground where deals were honored and disputes were settled with words rather than bullets. Most of the time, Russell had made his most recent trip to Thornhill in late September, as the aspen leaves were turning gold and the first hard frost had touched the high country. He'd packed out 3 months' worth of furs, beaver, marten, and one exceptional wolf pelt, dark and thick, that would fetch a premium price. The journey down had been uneventful. 2 days of steady riding through country he knew by heart. He'd arrived at the trading post in the afternoon, sold his furs to Samuel for a fair price, and had been going through his supply list when he'd sensed something different in the atmosphere. The trading post had a handful of other people that day, 2 settlers with their families, restocking before pushing on toward the Bitterroot Valley. A young trapper Russell recognized but didn't know by name, and an older couple who ran a small ranch about 30 miles south. But there was a tension in the air, a way people weren't quite meeting each other's eyes. Conversations died when Russell came near, then resumed in lower tones. Martha Thornhill's usual warmth seemed strained, and even Samuel appeared troubled, though he conducted their business with his customary professionalism. Russell had learned long ago not to involve himself in other people's affairs. Whatever was troubling the folks at the trading post was their concern, not his. He'd completed his purchases, packed his supplies, and had been preparing to spend one more night before heading back to his cabin. The rain had started in the late afternoon, steady and cold, the kind of rain that promised to continue through the night. It turned the packed earth around the trading post into mud and made the distant mountains disappear behind grey curtains of water. That was when everything changed. Russell had been loading the last of his supplies onto his packhorse, rain streaming off the brim of his hat when he'd noticed the wheelchair. It sat just beyond the covered porch of the trading post, fully exposed to the weather. And in that wheelchair sat a child, a little girl, small and thin, her dark hair plastered to her head by the rain. She wore a dress that had once been decent, but was now torn and filthy, soaked through to her skin. Her feet were bare, caked with mud. But it was her eyes that stopped Russell cold, empty, hollow eyes that stared at nothing, accepting the rain and the cold and the abandonment with the terrible resignation of someone who'd learned not to hope for better. For a long moment, Russell couldn't move. The rain continued to fall. The girl didn't flinch, didn't cry, didn't even seem to notice him standing there. And in that moment, looking at her small, broken form, Russell saw his Emma, saw her fever-bright eyes in those last days, saw the way she'd looked at him with trust even as life slipped away, saw everything he'd failed to protect, failed to save, failed to keep safe. His hands started shaking, his breath came short, and he knew, with the certainty of a man who'd spent 15 years running from exactly this feeling, that his carefully constructed isolation was about to shatter completely. Russell stood in the rain for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a minute, staring at the girl. Water ran down his neck, soaked through his buckskin shirt, but he barely noticed. The girl didn't look at him. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her head tilted slightly forward, as if she'd simply accepted that this was where she would remain, until the world forgot about her entirely. He could see now that she was perhaps 6 or 7 years old, though malnutrition made it hard to judge. Her face was gaunt, her arms thin as willow branches, where they emerged from the tattered sleeves of her dress. The wheelchair itself was crude but functional, built from rough-cut wood, with wheels that had seen better days. Someone had made it by hand, someone with basic carpentry skills but little refinement. One of the wheels was slightly warped, listing the chair at an odd angle. Russell forced himself to move. He crossed the muddy ground in a few long strides and knelt beside the wheelchair, bringing himself down to the girl's eye level. Up close, he could see that her lips were faintly blue from the cold, her breathing shallow. She'd been out here too long. The rain had probably been falling for an hour, maybe more. "Child," he said, keeping his voice low and gentle, What are you doing out here?" She didn't respond, didn't even blink. Her eyes remained fixed on some distant point only she could see. Russell reached out slowly and touched her hand. It was ice cold. That broke through his hesitation. Whatever was happening here, whatever circumstances had led to this moment, the immediate problem was simple. This child was going to catch her death if she stayed in this weather. He stood and turned toward the trading post. Through the windows, he could see people moving about inside, warm and dry. He could see Martha Thornhill at the counter, Samuel speaking with one of the settler families. They had to know the girl was out here. They had to. Russell climbed the steps to the covered porch and pushed through the door. The warmth inside hit him immediately, along with the smell of coffee and wood smoke and the general human scent of a busy trading post. Conversations didn't stop when he entered, but several people glanced his way, then quickly looked elsewhere. "Samuel," Russell said, and there was an edge in his voice he didn't bother to hide. "There's a child outside." In the rain, Samuel Thornhill set down the bundle of rope he'd been measuring and met Russell's eyes. There was genuine discomfort there, maybe even shame, but also a weariness that spoke of a problem with no good solution. "I know," Samuel said quietly. "You know?" Russell felt heat rising in his chest. "Then why in God's name is she sitting out there?" Martha came around the counter, wringing her hands in her apron. "Mr. Parker, it's not that simple." "It looks plenty simple to me," Russell interrupted. "There's a child, can't be more than 7 years old, sitting in the cold rain. How complicated does it need to be?" Samuel sighed and gestured toward a quieter corner of the trading post. "Let me explain." They moved away from the other customers, though Russell was aware that everyone in the building was listening. Samuel kept his voice low. "Family came through 2 days ago," he said. "Man named Morse, his wife, and 3 children. They had the girl with them, said she was the man's niece, that her parents had died. They were heading west, or so they claimed. They stayed one night, bought some supplies in the morning, and then when they left her." "Left her," Russell repeated flatly. "Pushed her wheelchair under the porch overhang and rode off," Martha said, her voice tight with suppressed emotion. "We didn't even realize she was there until an hour after they'd gone. By then, tracking them would have been—" "You could have brought her inside," Russell said. "We did," Samuel said. "We fed her, dried her off, put her by the fire. She didn't say a word, wouldn't tell us her name, wouldn't respond to questions. We tried, Mr. Parker. We honestly tried. But then," he paused and Martha finished for him. "Then people started talking about what to do with her. There's no law within 200 miles. No orphanage, no territorial office, nothing. The nearest place that might take in a child like her is Fort Benton, and that's a week's hard travel, maybe more with the weather turning. So you put her back outside," Russell said, and he couldn't keep the disgust from his voice. "That's not—" Samuel started, then stopped. His shoulders sagged. "The truth is, Mr. Parker, nobody wanted to take responsibility. The rancher couple said they already had 5 children and a hard winter coming. The trappers weren't going to take a child, especially not one who can't walk. The settlers were moving on today, and they made it clear they had no room. And Martha and I, we're not young anymore. A girl like that, she needs more care than we can give. She needs someone who won't leave her to die in the rain," Russell said sharply. The words hung in the air. Martha's eyes filled with tears. Samuel looked away, jaw tight. "We were going to contact the territorial authorities," Martha said. "Send a letter, ask for guidance. These things take time, but we weren't just going to—" "How long was she going to sit out there while you waited for guidance?" Russell asked. His voice was quieter now, but no less intense. No one answered. Russell looked around the trading post. The settler families were studiously examining goods on the shelves. The young trapper had his back turned. The rancher couple were whispering to each other. No one would meet his eyes. He turned back to Samuel. "What's her name?" "She won't tell us," Samuel said. "We've asked. She just stares. I don't think she's simple-minded, just scared. Or maybe she's been through so much that she's shut herself off from the world. Has she eaten?" "This morning," Martha said. "A little bread and broth. She didn't want much." Russell nodded slowly. He looked down at his hands, at the calluses and scars, at the dirt permanently ground into the creases of his palms. He thought about his cabin, designed for one person, accessible only by a narrow mountain trail. He thought about winter coming, about the isolation he'd cultivated so carefully. He thought about all the reasons this was impossible, impractical, insane. Then he thought about Emma and about the promise he'd made to Catherine. Take care of our girl. Make sure she knows she's loved. He'd failed that promise once. Maybe that was the real reason he'd run to these mountains, not just grief, but guilt. The terrible knowledge that he hadn't been enough, hadn't been able to protect the one thing that mattered most. I'll take her, he heard himself say. The room went still. Even the whispered conversations stopped. What? Samuel said, I'll take her. Russell repeated, louder this time. I'll take responsibility for the child. Martha's hand went to her mouth. Samuel stared at him, like he'd announced he was going to sprout wings and fly. Mr. Parker, Samuel said carefully, you live alone in the mountains. You're not equipped for a child, especially not one with special needs. She can't walk. She'd need constant care. I know what she needs, Russell said. His voice was steady now, certain. I had a daughter once. I know how to care for a child, but your lifestyle, Martha protested, the isolation, the conditions, are better than leaving her to strangers who don't want her, Russell said. Or worse, leaving her here to wait for help that might never come. He looked at Samuel directly. You know I can provide for her. You know I keep my word. If I say I'll take responsibility for this child, then I will. For as long as she needs. Samuel studied him for a long moment. Then slowly he nodded. I believe you would. But Russell, think about this. Really think. This isn't a wounded animal you can nurse and release. This is a human child who needs more than just food and shelter. I know, Russell said quietly. And he did know. He knew he was making a decision that would change everything, that would shatter the careful walls he'd built around his grief. But he also knew that if he walked away from this, if he left this child to whatever fate awaited her, he'd never forgive himself. Let me get some supplies together, Samuel said finally. Extra blankets, some proper clothes for her. I'll make you up a bundle, and you can pay me next trip if need be. I'll pay now, Russell said. And Samuel, thank you. Martha moved toward him and squeezed his arm. You're a good man, Russel Parker. Better than most. Russell didn't feel good. He felt terrified. But he nodded and went back outside. The rain had lightened to a drizzle. The girl was exactly where he'd left her, unchanged, unmoving. Russell approached the wheelchair and knelt down again. This time, he reached up and carefully tucked a strand of wet hair behind her ear. In that hair, barely visible, was a tattered blue ribbon, once bright but now faded and frayed. Come with me, he said softly. I don't know your name yet, and I don't know what brought you here, but I know you shouldn't be alone. So come with me, and we'll figure the rest out together. For the first time, the girl moved. Her eyes shifted just slightly and focused on his face. They were gray eyes, storm-colored, old beyond their years. She looked at him for a long moment, assessing, judging, deciding whether this was another betrayal waiting to happen. Then, so quietly, he almost missed it. She spoke. Cold, she whispered. Russell felt something crack inside his chest. I know, child. I know you are. Let's get you warm. He stood and grasped the handles of the wheelchair. The wheel was indeed warped, making it pull to one side, but it rolled. He pushed it toward his wagon, careful over the muddy ground, and began the process of figuring out how to load both a child and a wheelchair onto a packhorse rig designed for furs and supplies. Behind him, in the trading post window, Samuel and Martha watched. Around them, the other customers whispered, but Russell didn't look back. He focused on the practical problem in front of him, on the child who'd spoken one word and then fallen silent again, on the long journey ahead. The rain continued to fall, but gentler now, almost tender. And as Russell worked to secure the wheelchair, as he wrapped the shivering girl in his own dry coat, as he made ready to return to his mountain cabin with a burden he'd never expected to carry, he felt something he hadn't felt in 15 years. Purpose. The journey to Russell's cabin took 3 days instead of the usual 2. The wheelchair complicated everything. Russell had fashioned a travois of sorts, lashing poles to either side of his pack-horse and creating a platform where the girl could sit wrapped in blankets while the wheelchair was strapped alongside. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. Though the uneven terrain made for slow going, the girl, he still didn't know her name, remained silent for most of the first day. She watched the world pass with those storm-grey eyes, taking in the pine forests and granite peaks without comment. When they stopped for the night, Russell built a fire and heated beans and salt pork in his small pot. He'd made camp countless times over the years, but never with company. And he found himself acutely aware of every action, seeing his rough habits through someone else's eyes. He tried to make conversation as they ate, keeping his voice low and steady. "Those mountains there, they're called the Sapphires, named for the color of the lakes you find up high come summer. Ever seen a sapphire?" No response. The girl ate mechanically, small bites, her attention fixed on the fire. "I've got a cabin about a day and a half from here," he continued. "It's not much, but it's warm and dry. Got a good roof, good walls. You'll be safe there." Still nothing. But when he handed her a tin cup of water, she took it with both hands and drank slowly, carefully, like someone who'd learned not to waste anything. That night, Russell gave her all the blankets and slept close to the fire in his coat. He woke several times, worried she'd gotten cold or needed something, but each time she was sleeping peacefully, curled on her side with her thin arms wrapped around herself. In the morning, she was awake before him, watching the dawn light filter through the trees. On the second day, as they climbed higher into the mountains, Russell tried a different approach. "I had a daughter once," he said, speaking as much to the trees as to the girl. "Her name was Emma. She'd be about your age now if she'd lived. She died when she was 8 years old. Scarlet fever." He glanced back at the travois. The girl was looking at him now, really looking, with something approaching interest in her eyes. "She used to follow me everywhere," he continued, the words coming easier than he'd expected. "Into my workshop, to the general store, out to the garden. Always asking questions. Why does wood split along the grain, Papa? Why do birds fly south? Why is the sky blue?" I didn't always have good answers, but I tried. They traveled in silence for a while. And then, so softly he almost missed it, the girl spoke. "Sarah!" Russell pulled his horse to a stop and turned fully around. "What's that?" "Sarah," she repeated, a bit louder this time. "My name is Sarah." Russell felt warmth spread through his chest. "Sarah, that's a good, strong name." He paused, then added, "I'm Russell. Russel Parker. It's good to meet you properly, Sarah." For the first time, he saw the ghost of something that might become a smile touch the corners of her mouth. It vanished almost immediately, but it had been there. They reached the cabin in the late afternoon of the third day. Russell had been worried about how Sarah would react to the isolation, to the small, rough structure that would be her home. But when she saw it nestled in the meadow with the mountains rising behind it, something changed in her expression. Not quite relief, but perhaps a lessening of the fear that had been her constant companion. The real challenges became apparent immediately. The cabin had a single entrance, approached by 3 rough-cut steps. The interior was designed for a man who could move freely, with the rope bed set high off the ground, shelves mounted at convenient reaching height, and the privy a 30-yard walk through uneven terrain. None of it was suitable for a child in a wheelchair. Russell carried Sarah inside first, settling her in one of his chairs near the fireplace while he went back for the wheelchair. When he returned, he found her looking around with careful attention, taking in the sparse furnishings, the bundles of dried herbs hanging from the rafters, the furs stretched on frames against one wall, his tools arranged on their pegs. "It's not fancy," he said, suddenly self-conscious about the dust in the corners, the cobwebs, the general bachelor disarray. "But it's clean enough and it keeps the weather out." He set about building up the fire, then heated water for washing. Sarah's clothes were in terrible condition, the dress torn in several places, stained beyond saving. Martha Thornhill had sent along 2 simple dresses in a bundle, along with proper undergarments, stockings, and a warm coat. There was also a hairbrush, soap, and other necessities. The problem of bathing and dressing Sarah presented itself with uncomfortable clarity. Russell had no experience with this beyond caring for Emma when she was very young, and even then, Catherine had handled most of it. He heated water, set up a basin, and then cleared his throat awkwardly. "I'll step outside while you wash," he said. "Take your time. The water should stay warm for a while." Sarah looked at him with those grave eyes, then glanced down at her useless legs. "I can't," she said simply. "Can't reach. Can't balance." Russell felt his face redden. "Right, of course. I'll help then. But I'll try to be respectful about it." He helped her as carefully as he could, averting his eyes when possible, focusing on the practical needs. Sarah bore it stoically, though he could see the humiliation in her stiff shoulders, the way she stared at the wall. When she was finally clean and dressed in one of the new dresses, Russell combed through her tangled hair as gently as he could manage. The blue ribbon from before was beyond saving, but he tied her hair back with a strip of leather cord. The sleeping arrangements posed another problem. His bed was too high for Sarah to get into, even with help, and far too large. After some thought, Russell fashioned a makeshift bed on the floor near the fireplace, using blankets and his spare furs. It wasn't ideal, but it was warm and soft, and Sarah settled into it without complaint. That first night, Russell made a simple supper of beans and cornbread. Sarah ate more than she had on the trail, which he took as a good sign. After supper, as darkness fell and the fire crackled, an awkward silence settled over the cabin. Russell had grown accustomed to his own company, to evenings spent in quiet contemplation or working on small projects by firelight. Having another person present felt strange. Like wearing boots on the wrong feet, he went to his trunk and dug through it until he found what he was looking for. A small wooden doll, carved from pine, with articulated joints and a simple painted face. He'd made it for Emma years ago, one of the last things he'd crafted before leaving Pennsylvania. He'd never been able to throw it away, though looking at it had always brought pain. He crossed to where Sarah lay in her makeshift bed and held out the doll. "This was my daughter's," he said quietly. "I made it for her. She loved it more than any store-bought toy." He paused, then added, "I'd like you to have it if you want it." Sarah stared at the doll for a long moment. Then slowly she reached out and took it. She held it carefully as if it might break, turning it over to examine the carved details. When she looked up at Russell, there were tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. Russell nodded, his throat too tight for words. He returned to his chair and sat watching the fire, listening to the small sounds of Sarah settling into sleep behind him. The doll was clutched tight in her arms. Outside, the wind moved through the pines with a sound like distant water. The mountains stood silent and eternal under the stars. And inside the cabin, for the first time in 15 years, Russel Parker was not alone. He didn't sleep much that night. Every time Sarah stirred or made a sound, he was instantly alert, checking to make sure she was all right. The responsibility he'd taken on felt overwhelming in the darkness. What did he know about raising a child, especially one with such challenges? What if he failed her the way he'd failed Emma? What if his decision to bring her here had been arrogance rather than compassion? But when dawn came and Sarah woke, she looked at him with something that hadn't been there before, a tentative trust, fragile as frost, but unmistakably present. And Russell knew, for better or worse, that there was no going back now. The first week passed in a blur of adjustments and improvisations. Russell discovered that caring for Sarah required rethinking nearly every aspect of his daily routine. The simple act of cooking became complicated when he realized she couldn't reach the table from her wheelchair. He spent an afternoon crafting a lower surface she could use, attaching it to one of his chairs at the right height. The privy situation proved even more challenging, until he devised a chamber pot arrangement with a privacy screen he could set up in the corner of the cabin. But the physical accommodations were only part of it. Sarah herself was a puzzle he was learning to read slowly. She remained quiet most of the time, speaking only when necessary, but Russell began to notice patterns. She tensed when he moved too quickly or spoke too loudly. She watched the door constantly, as if expecting someone to come through it. She ate carefully, never taking more than her fair share, always asking permission before touching anything. These were behaviors learned from hardship, Russell realized, from people who'd made her feel she was a burden, an inconvenience to be endured, rather than a person to be valued. On the fourth morning, Russell began building a ramp. The cabin's entrance steps had been bothering him since they'd arrived. Every time Sarah needed to go outside, he had to carry her, leaving the wheelchair behind. It wasn't sustainable, and more importantly, it robbed her of any independence. He worked steadily, cutting and fitting boards, angling the ramp at a gentle slope. Sarah watched from her wheelchair just inside the door, the wooden doll clutched in her lap. As he worked, Russell found himself talking, filling the silence with observations about the wood, the weather, the ravens that had been harassing his food cache. "You see those birds?" he said, pointing to where 3 large ravens perched in a nearby pine. "They're smart, those ones. Smarter than most people give them credit for. They remember faces, hold grudges. I made the mistake of shooing one away from my drying rack last year, and now the whole family makes it their business to bother me whenever they can." Sarah's eyes followed the ravens. "They're big," she said quietly. "Big and bold," Russell agreed. Emma used to call them sky pirates, said they dressed in black and stole things, just like pirates in the stories. Did she like stories? Sarah asked. It was the first question she'd asked him that wasn't about immediate needs, and Russell felt something warm settle in his chest. She loved them. Her mama used to read to her every night. After Catherine died, I kept up the practice, though I wasn't near as good at the different voices. What happened to them? Sarah asked, then quickly added, "If you don't want to talk about it, that's—" "No," Russell interrupted gently. "It's all right." He sat back on his heels, hammer in hand, and looked at the mountains. Catherine died having a baby. The baby didn't make it either. I kept Emma safe for 3 more years after that. But then scarlet fever came through town, and I couldn't protect her from that. I tried. God knows I tried. But sometimes trying isn't enough. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My mama and papa died too. Wagon accident. I was under a blanket in the back when it happened. I couldn't see, but I heard everything. After that, my mama's brother took me in. Uncle Clayton. It was the most she'd spoken at once since arriving." Russell kept working on the ramp, giving her space to continue or stop as she chose. "He didn't want me," Sarah continued, her voice flat. His wife didn't either. They had 3 children already, and I couldn't walk, couldn't help with chores. They said I was dead weight. They'd lock me in the shed sometimes when they didn't want to deal with me. Fed me scraps, she paused. Then they left me at the trading post. I knew they were going to. I heard them talking about it the night before. Russell's hands stilled on the hammer. He turned to look at Sarah directly. Her face was composed, but her knuckles were white where she gripped the doll. "That should never have happened to you," he said firmly. "You're not dead weight. You're not a burden. You're a child who deserves kindness and care, same as any other." "Can't even walk," Sarah said, and there was a brittleness in her voice that cut at him. "So what?" Russell said. "You got a good mind, good hands, good eyes. You can do plenty with those. Walking isn't everything." He stood and gestured to the half-finished ramp. "This here will let you get in and out on your own. No need to wait for me to carry you. You want to go outside and look at the sky, you can do that. Want to sit in the sun, you can do that. Might take you a bit longer to get places, but you'll get there." Sarah looked at the ramp, then back at him. "Why are you doing this?" "Doing what?" "Being nice. Taking care of me. You didn't have to." Russell walked over and knelt beside her wheelchair so they were at eye level. "Sarah, I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to believe it. Nobody has to care for a child, but the fact that they choose to, that's what makes it matter. I chose to bring you here. I chose to build this ramp, and I'll keep choosing every day, because that's what you do for people you care about." Her eyes searched his face, looking for deception or false comfort. Whatever she saw, there must have satisfied her, because she nodded slowly. The ramp took him 2 more days to complete, and smooth enough that the wheelchair could navigate it safely. When it was done, Russell demonstrated how it worked, then stepped back. "Want to try?" he asked. Sarah gripped the wheels of her chair and pushed. The chair rolled forward, bumped over the threshold, and started down the ramp. It picked up a little speed. Russell tensed, ready to grab it if needed. But Sarah controlled it well, and a moment later she was outside on level ground. In the autumn sunshine, the expression on her face made every hour of work worthwhile. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was close. She looked around as if seeing the meadow and the mountains for the first time, even though she'd been staring at them through the window for days. "I can come out whenever I want now?" she asked. "Whenever you want," Russell confirmed. "Just be mindful not to go too far until you know the ground. There are rocks and holes that'll catch a wheel if you're not careful." Over the following days, Sarah began to explore the area around the cabin. She couldn't go far. The meadow grass was too thick in places, and the forest floor too uneven, but she could manage the cleared spaces Russell had created over the years. He watched her from the corner of his eye as he went about his work, seeing the way her shoulders straightened a little more each day, the way her eyes took on a spark of curiosity rather than just wariness. He'd gone up to the cabin's small loft and brought down something he'd stored there years ago, a small wooden rocking chair he'd made for Emma. It had been too painful to look at, so he'd wrapped it in canvas and put it out of sight. Now he unwrapped it, examining the joints and runners. The chair was still sound, just dusty. He spent an evening cleaning and oiling it, then set it near the fireplace. When Sarah saw it the next morning, she went very still. "That was hers?" she asked quietly. "It was," Russell said, "and I'd like you to have it if you want it. It's not a wheelchair. You'd need help getting in and out of it. But it's comfortable for sitting by the fire, and it rocks real nice." Sarah reached out and touched the arm of the chair, her fingers tracing the smooth wood. "You made it?" "I did. Emma was 4 years old when I finished it. She'd sit in it every evening while Catherine read to her. Won't it make you sad?" Sarah asked, looking up at him. "To see me in it?" Russell considered the question seriously. "Maybe a little sad," he admitted, "but also happy knowing it's being used again. Knowing Emma's chair is helping another little girl feel comfortable and safe. I think she'd like that." That evening, Russell lifted Sarah into the rocking chair for the first time. She settled into it with a sigh, and he showed her how to push with her feet, or in her case, shift her weight to make it rock. Soon she had the rhythm of it, moving gently back and forth, the doll cradled in her arms. "Russell," she said after a while. "Yes?" "Thank you. For everything." He nodded, his throat tight. "You're welcome, Sarah." Outside, the autumn evening was fading into night. Inside, the fire crackled warm. And for the first time since leaving Pennsylvania, Russell felt something he'd thought was lost forever. The sense of being needed, of having someone to care for, of having a reason beyond mere survival. He took out his journal that night, the one he'd stopped writing in years ago. He opened to a fresh page and began to write, documenting Sarah's arrival, her progress, the small victories and remaining challenges. It felt good to record things again, to mark the passage of days with something other than trap counts and weather observations. He wrote late into the night, by firelight, while Sarah slept peacefully in her makeshift bed, the doll and the rocking chair nearby, and the mountains standing guard in the darkness beyond the walls. 2 months passed, and the high country transformed around them. The aspens shed their golden leaves, the first snows dusted the peaks, and the animals began their preparations for winter. Russell worked longer days, making sure his meat cache was full, his firewood stacked high, his trap lines set before the deep cold arrived. Sarah was never far from his thoughts, even when he was out in the forest. He found himself hurrying back earlier than he used to, eager to return to the warmth of the cabin and the quiet companionship that had developed between them. Sarah had changed remarkably in those 2 months. Her face had filled out, color returning to her cheeks. Her hair, now clean and regularly brushed, fell in dark waves past her shoulders. More importantly, she'd begun to speak freely, asking questions, offering observations, even laughing occasionally at Russell's dry commentary about the ravens or the squirrels raiding his stores. She was still cautious, still sometimes flinched at sudden movements, but the hollow look had left her eyes. She'd also proven herself capable in ways Russell hadn't anticipated. He'd set up a work area at her level where she could shell beans, mend clothes, and help with food preparation. Her hands were nimble, and she took pride in contributing. When he brought in game to butcher, she didn't turn away squeamish like many would. Instead, she asked questions about the anatomy, about which cuts were best for what purposes. She had Emma's curiosity, that same hunger to understand how things worked. One afternoon in late October, Russell was sorting through his possessions when he came across something he'd forgotten he had, a small tin whistle, tarnished with age. It had belonged to his father, who'd played simple tunes on it during long winter evenings. Russell cleaned it up, tested a few notes, and found it still worked. That evening, after supper, he showed it to Sarah. "You ever heard music before?" he asked. "Sometimes," she said. "At church, when we lived in the wagon camp. There was a lady with a guitar." Russell played a simple melody, the notes thin but clear in the cabin's small space. When he finished, Sarah was leaning forward in her rocking chair, eyes bright with interest. "Can you teach me?" she asked. "I don't see why not," Russell said. "My fingers are too big and clumsy for the fine work, but yours might do better." Over the following weeks, he taught her what he remembered: basic scales, simple folk tunes, the breath control needed to make the notes ring true. Sarah took to it with unexpected aptitude. Soon she could play Red River Valley and Shenandoah well enough that Russell found himself humming along as he worked. The cabin, which had been silent for so many years, now had music in it again. It was during one of these evening music sessions that Sarah revealed more about her past. They'd been playing together. Russell had fashioned a simple drum from a wooden box and hide, keeping rhythm while Sarah handled the melody when she stopped mid-tune. "Uncle Clayton used to get angry when I made noise," she said quietly. "He said useless children should be quiet, that I should be grateful for the scraps they gave me and not ask for anything more." Russell set down his makeshift drum, his jaw tight. He was wrong. About all of it. "They'd lock me in the shed for hours if I cried or complained," Sarah continued, staring at the whistle in her hands. "It was dark in there. Cold in winter, hot in summer. There were mice, sometimes rats. I learned to be quiet, learned to not need anything." "Sarah," Russell began, but she kept talking, the words flowing now like water through a broken dam. "The day they left me at the trading post, they didn't even say goodbye. Just wheeled me under the porch and drove off. I watched them go. Part of me thought maybe they'd come back, that it was some kind of test. But they didn't. And then it started raining, and I thought," her voice caught, "I thought maybe I'd just sit there until I disappeared. Until everyone forgot I'd ever existed." Russell moved to kneel beside her rocking chair. "But you didn't disappear. You're here and you're real and you matter. You understand me? You matter." Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I know, I'm starting to know. But sometimes I'm scared I'll wake up and this will all be gone. That you'll realize I'm too much trouble and—" "No," Russell said firmly. "That's not going to happen. You're not trouble, Sarah. You're—" He paused, searching for the right words. "You're the best thing that's happened to me in 15 years. She looked at him with those storm-gray eyes, searching his face. Then tentatively she reached out and hugged him. It was awkward. She was sitting, he was kneeling. They were both unused to such gestures, but it was real. Russell wrapped his arms around her carefully, feeling her small frame shake with quiet sobs, and for the first time since Emma died. He let himself cry too. They stayed like that for a long time. Two broken people holding each other together in a cabin in the mountains, while the fire crackled and the wind sang through the pines outside. But not everything was peaceful progress. Around the time the first serious snow fell, Russell began noticing things that troubled him. Small things at first. Tracks near his trap lines that weren't his own. Signs that someone had been poking around his cache sites. He told himself it was probably just another trapper passing through. Though few worked this high into the mountains, and none had ventured this close to his territory in years. Then he found a campsite about a mile from his cabin, recent enough that the fire pit was still warm. Whoever had been there had left quickly, not bothering to cover their traces. Russell examined the site carefully. 3 men, based on the tracks. They'd had horses, well-shod ones, not the rough mountain ponies most trappers used. They'd sat watching something for hours. The ground was trampled flat where they'd kept their vigil. Watching what? Or whom? Russell felt unease settle into his gut. He increased his vigilance, keeping his rifle close, listening for sounds that didn't belong. He didn't mention it to Sarah. No need to frighten her, but he noticed she picked up on his tension anyway. She grew quieter again, more watchful. A few days later, Samuel Thornhill arrived at the cabin unannounced. It was unusual for anyone to make the journey this late in the season. And the grave expression on Samuel's face told Russell this wasn't a social call. "Thought I'd check on you and the girl," Samuel said, as Russell helped him unsaddle his horse. "Wanted to see how you were managing with winter coming on." But once they were inside, and Samuel had greeted Sarah warmly. Once she'd demonstrated her whistle playing, and Samuel had praised her progress. The older man's expression grew serious again. "There's been talk in town," Samuel said quietly, speaking to Russell while Sarah practiced her scales in the corner. "About the girl. About you taking her. What kind of talk?" Russell asked, though he thought he knew. "Some folks think it's not proper, an unmarried man raising a little girl alone in the mountains. Others," Samuel paused uncomfortably, "others say there are legal considerations, that the territory has laws about guardianship, about who can take responsibility for a child." Russell's hands tightened on his coffee cup. Sarah was abandoned. No one wanted her. "I took her in when no one else would. That should be the end of it." "Should be," Samuel agreed. "But it's not. There's been a man asking questions. Arrived in Thornhill about a week ago. Says he's the girl's uncle, that he made a mistake leaving her, that he wants her back." The bottom dropped out of Russell's stomach. "Clayton Morse," Samuel nodded. "You know him." "Sarah told me about him." "About how they treated her." Russell glanced at Sarah, making sure she couldn't hear. "He locked her in a shed, Samuel. Fed her scraps, made her feel worthless. Whatever he wants now, it's not out of love or concern." "I believe you," Samuel said. "But the law doesn't care much about what we believe. He's got a legal claim as her blood relative. If he pushes it, if he gets the territorial authorities involved, they might make you give her up." Russell felt panic rising in his chest, a sensation he hadn't experienced since watching Emma slip away. "There has to be something I can do, some way to make this official legal." Samuel reached into his coat and pulled out a folded document. "I brought papers for guardianship. If you file them with the territorial office, establish yourself as her legal guardian, it might carry weight." "But Russell," he met his friend's eyes seriously, "it might not be enough. Family claims usually trump everything else, especially when the child can't testify to abuse. She can tell them she's 7 years old and unable to walk. You know how that'll look to a judge? They'll say she's too young to know her own mind, too dependent on whoever's caring for her to be objective. They'll say Morse is her blood, and blood matters." Russell looked at the papers in Samuel's hand, then at Sarah in the corner, completely absorbed in her music, unaware of the threat gathering around her. He thought about losing her, about watching her be taken back to people who'd treated her as less than human, and something fierce and protective rose in him. "I won't let that happen," he said quietly. "I know you'll try," Samuel said. "That's why I brought something else." He reached into his other pocket and pulled out a leather holster with a well-maintained revolver, just in case trying isn't enough. Samuel stayed only one night before heading back to Thornhill, but his visit had left Russell deeply unsettled. The guardianship papers sat on the table, filled out and ready to file, but getting them to the territorial office would mean a journey of at least 2 weeks, and leaving Sarah alone that long was unthinkable. Russell decided he'd wait until spring, when the travel would be safer and he could take Sarah with him. In the meantime, he took Samuel's warnings seriously. He kept the revolver cleaned and loaded, though he hid it where Sarah wouldn't find it. He scouted the approaches to his cabin regularly, looking for signs of intruders. And he taught Sarah what to do if trouble came, where to hide, how to stay quiet, when to use the whistle he gave her to signal for help. She asked questions, of course. She was too smart not to notice the change in his behavior. "Is someone coming?" she asked one evening. As Russell checked the cabin's door for the third time that day, he considered lying, then decided against it. Sarah had been lied to enough in her short life. "Maybe," he said. "Your uncle, the one who left you at the trading post. He's been asking about you in town." Sarah's face went pale. The tin whistle she'd been holding clattered to the floor. "He's coming here?" "I don't know," Russell said honestly. "But if he does, I won't let him take you." "You have my word on that. He'll say I belong to him," Sarah said, her voice small and frightened. "He'll say he has the right. Rights don't mean much if they're not backed by decency," Russell said. He came and knelt beside her rocking chair. "Sarah, I need you to trust me." "Can you do that?" She looked at him with those grey eyes that had seen too much hardship. Then she nodded. "I trust you." "Good. Then trust that I'll keep you safe no matter what it takes." The words felt like a vow, sacred and binding. Russell meant them with everything in him. The next morning, he found fresh tracks again, closer this time, less than a quarter-mile from the cabin. 3 riders, the same as before, moving in a wide circle around his property. They weren't even trying to hide their presence anymore. They wanted him to know they were there, wanted him nervous and off balance. Russell spent that day fortifying the cabin. He reinforced the door, made sure the shutters on the windows were secure, and positioned his rifle and the revolver where he could reach them quickly. He filled extra water barrels and brought in more firewood than they'd need for a week. If it came to a siege, he'd be ready. Sarah watched these preparations with growing anxiety. That night, she had her first nightmare since arriving at the cabin, waking with a cry, thrashing in her blankets. Russell was beside her in an instant, holding her gently until the terror passed. "He locked me in the dark," she whispered against his shoulder. "He said I was nothing. He said no one would ever want me." "He was wrong," Russell said firmly. "I want you. You're my daughter in every way that matters, and I'll be damned if I let anyone hurt you again." It was the first time he'd called her his daughter out loud, though he'd been thinking it for weeks. Sarah pulled back to look at him, tears streaming down her face. "Really?" she asked. "You mean that?" "I mean it," Russell said. "Emma was my daughter by birth. You're my daughter by choice. And choice, Sarah, that's stronger than blood." She hugged him then, fierce and desperate, and Russell held her close, feeling the weight of his promise settle onto his shoulders. He would protect this child, whatever it took. 3 days later they came. Russell heard the horses before he saw them, 3 riders approaching through the early morning mist. He'd been up for hours, unable to sleep, and had the cabin locked down tight with Sarah, hidden in a space he'd created beneath the floorboards. It wasn't much, just a crawl space that had once been for storage. But it would keep her out of sight if things went badly. He stepped out onto the porch with his rifle cradled in his arms, not pointing at anyone but ready. The riders emerged from the mist, 3 hard-looking men bundled in heavy coats. The one in front was lean and sharp-featured, with cold eyes and a mouth set in a perpetual sneer. Clayton Morse. Russell recognized him from Sarah's descriptions. "That's far enough," Russell called when they were about 30 yards out. "State your business." Clayton reined in his horse. The 2 men with him, hired muscle from the look of them, flanked him on either side. "My business is with my niece," Clayton said. His voice was thin and nasal, with an edge of barely controlled anger. "The girl you took from the trading post. I've come to bring her home." "She is home," Russell said, "and she's not going anywhere." "You got no legal right to her," Clayton spat. "She's my blood. My responsibility. You're just some mountain hermit who had no business interfering." "I had every business," Russell said coldly. "You abandoned her, left her in the rain like she was trash you didn't want to haul. That ended whatever rights you had." Clayton's face flushed red. "That was a mistake. We were under strain, traveling hard. We intended to come back for her." "Liar," Russell said flatly. "Sarah told me how you treated her. The shed, the scraps, making her feel worthless. You didn't make a mistake. You saw a chance to be rid of a burden, and you took it." "The girl's a cripple," Clayton said, and there was genuine contempt in his voice. She can't work, can't help, can't do nothing but eat food and take up space. But she's still mine by law, and I want her back. Why? Russell asked. Why now, after months? What's changed? Something flickered in Clayton's eyes. Calculation, greed. That's my affair? Then bring out the girl, or I'll go get the territorial marshal and make you give her up legal-like. You do that, Russell said. Go get the marshal. Bring a judge, too. Let them hear about how you treated a helpless child. See if they think you deserve to have her back. Clayton's hand moved toward the pistol at his hip. The two men with him tensed, ready for violence. I wouldn't, Russell said quietly, shifting the rifle just enough to make his point clear. I know these mountains. I know every rock, every tree, every place a man might hide. You start something here and you'll end here, buried somewhere your families will never find you. It wasn't an idle threat. Russell meant every word, and Clayton seemed to recognize that. His hand moved away from his gun. This ain't over, Clayton snarled. I'll be back, and next time I'll have the law with me. Then we'll see who's got rights and who doesn't. You do that, Russell repeated. But until then you stay off my land. Next time I see you within a mile of here, I won't bother with warnings. Clayton jerked his horse's head around and spurred it back toward the trail, his companions following. They disappeared into the morning mist like ghosts, but Russell didn't lower his rifle until the sound of hoofbeats had faded completely. He waited another 10 minutes, making sure they weren't circling back, then returned to the cabin and helped Sarah out of the crawl space. She was shaking, her face pale. I heard everything, she whispered. He wants me back. Wanting isn't getting, Russell said, though his heart was heavy with worry. But Sarah, I need to tell you something, and I need you to understand it fully. He sat down so they were at eye level, taking her cold hands in his. Clayton mentioned the law, and he's right. He does have a legal claim as your uncle. If he gets the territorial authorities involved, there's a chance they might side with him. Blood relation carries weight in these matters, but I said I wouldn't let him take you, and I meant it. But we need to be smart about this. We need to think ahead. He paused, weighing his words carefully. There's something I have to ask you, and it's important. Do you remember anything about your parents? Your real parents, before the accident? Sarah frowned, thinking. Not much. I was little, maybe 4 years old when they died. I remember my mama had pretty hair. My papa was tall. We lived in a wagon most of the time, traveling. But that's all. Why? Because if Clayton isn't really your uncle, if there's something wrong with his story, that changes everything, Russell said. Tomorrow, I'm going to ride down to Thornhill and send some telegrams. I'm going to find out everything I can about Clayton Morse and about you. And while I'm gone, you're going to stay with Samuel and Martha at the trading post, where you'll be safe and around other people. I don't want to leave here, Sarah protested. It's just for a few days, Russell assured her. And it's necessary. If Clayton does come back with the law, I want to have answers ready. I want to know exactly who we're dealing with. Sarah nodded reluctantly, though fear still shadowed her eyes. Russell, what if they make me go with him anyway? What if the law says I have to? Russell squeezed her hands gently. Then we'll figure something out. I promise you, Sarah, you're not going back to that life. I'll make sure of it, even if I have to. He stopped himself. Some promises were better left unspoken. That night, Russell barely slept. He sat in his chair with the rifle across his knees, watching the darkness beyond the windows, listening for the sound of returning horses. But the night remained quiet except for the wind and the occasional cry of an owl hunting in the distance. In the morning, he began preparations for the journey to Thornhill. He packed what they'd need, secured the cabin, and tried not to think about all the ways this could go wrong. Sarah was quiet during the preparations, clutching her wooden doll, occasionally playing soft notes on her tin whistle, as if the music could ward off the darkness gathering around them. As they set out, Russell looked back at the cabin one more time. It had been his sanctuary for 15 years, his refuge from pain and memory. Now it was something more. It was home, a place worth fighting for. And he would fight, whatever it took, to keep the family he'd found from being torn apart again. The journey to Thornhill took 2 hard days through increasingly difficult weather. Snow fell steadily, covering the trail and making navigation treacherous. Russell kept Sarah wrapped in furs on the travois, stopping frequently to make sure she was warm enough. They spoke little, both lost in their own worries about what lay ahead. They arrived at the trading post in the late afternoon to find it busier than usual. A freight wagon had come through, and several families were stocking up before the winter storms made travel impossible. Samuel greeted them with obvious relief, taking Sarah's wheelchair down while Martha bundled the girl inside to warm her by the fire. Russell waited until Sarah was settled and occupied, with a cup of hot tea before pulling Samuel aside. "I need to send telegrams," he said quietly. "To Pennsylvania, maybe Philadelphia. I need to find out everything I can about Clayton Morse and about Sarah's background." Samuel nodded. "The telegraph office won't open until morning, but I can help you compose the messages tonight." "What exactly are you looking for?" "Anything that proves Clayton isn't who he says he is, or that he doesn't have a legitimate claim on Sarah," Russell said. "Something feels wrong about his story. The way he showed up suddenly, months after abandoning her. The way he talked about wanting her back, but couldn't even hide his contempt for her. There's something else going on." They worked late into the night, drafting careful inquiries to county records offices, to law enforcement agencies, to anyone who might have information. Samuel agreed to send the messages first thing in the morning and to house Sarah while they waited for responses. The next day, Russell prepared to return to his cabin. He couldn't leave it unguarded for long, and he needed to be ready in case Clayton came back. Saying goodbye to Sarah was harder than he'd expected. "I'll be back in a few days," he told her, kneeling beside her wheelchair in Samuel's back room. "You stay here with Samuel and Martha. Stay safe and don't worry. We're going to figure this out. Promise you'll come back?" Sarah asked, her voice small. "I promise," Russell said. "Wild horses couldn't keep me away." She hugged him tightly, and he held her for a long moment before forcing himself to pull away. As he rode out of Thornhill, he looked back to see her watching from the window, the wooden doll clutched in her arms, and his heart ached with the weight of responsibility and love. He was halfway back to his cabin when he saw the riders. 3 of them again, but this time approaching from a different direction. Russell's hand went to his rifle, but as they drew closer, he recognized the lead rider. It was the territorial marshal, a stern-faced man named Garrett, whom Russell had met once or twice over the years. Riding with him were Clayton Morse and one of his hired men. Russell reined in his horse and waited, keeping his expression neutral as they approached. "Mr. Parker," Marshal Garrett said, touching his hat brim in greeting. "I was hoping to find you. We need to have a conversation about the girl you're keeping." "I'm not keeping her," Russell said evenly. "I'm caring for her. There's a difference. Be that as it may, Mr. Morse here has filed a formal complaint with the territorial office. He claims you're holding his niece against his will, preventing him from exercising his legal guardianship rights." Russell glanced at Clayton, who sat his horse with a smug expression. "He abandoned her, left her in the rain at Thornhill Trading Post. Ask Samuel Thornhill if you don't believe me." "I've already spoken with Mr. Thornhill," the marshal said. "He confirmed the girl was left at his establishment. But Mr. Morse claims that was a misunderstanding, that circumstances forced him to make temporary arrangements, and that he always intended to return for her." "That's a damned lie," Russell said. "Watch your tongue," Clayton snapped. "That's my niece you stole." "Gentlemen," the marshal interrupted, raising a hand. "This can be settled civilly. Mr. Parker, do you have any legal documentation establishing your guardianship of the child?" "I have papers," Russell said. "Drawn up but not yet filed. They're at my cabin." "Then I suggest we all ride there together," the marshal said. "We'll review the situation, examine your documentation, and determine the proper course of action." Russell didn't like it. Didn't like Clayton knowing exactly where his cabin was. Didn't like the marshal's official tone. But he had little choice. He nodded curtly and turned his horse back toward the mountains. The ride took the rest of the day, and by the time they reached the cabin, dusk was falling. Russell led them inside, lit the lamps, and retrieved the guardianship papers from his table. He also brought out the journal he'd been keeping, documenting Sarah's arrival and progress. "As you can see," Russell said, "I've been caring for her properly. She's healthy, well-fed, learning to read and do music. She's got a safe place to sleep, warm clothes, everything she needs." Marshal Garrett examined the papers carefully. "These are in order, though they should have been filed within 30 days of taking custody. The fact that you haven't done so works against you." "I was waiting for spring," Russell said. "The journey to the territorial office is dangerous in winter, especially with a child who can't walk." "Still," the marshal said, "the law is clear. Without filed documentation, you have no legal standing. Mr. Morse, as the girl's uncle and blood relative, has priority claim." "That's right," Clayton said, stepping forward. "Now where is she?" "I'll take her back tonight. She's not here," Russell said flatly. "She's safe at Thornhill, and she's staying there until this is resolved properly." Clayton's face flushed with anger. "You can't keep her from me." "Marshal," Russell interrupted, "before you make any decisions, I think you should see something." He'd noticed it during the confrontation at his cabin days before, when Clayton had dismounted. A leather pouch had fallen from his saddlebag. Russell had found it later while checking the area. He'd examined its contents and had been waiting for the right moment to reveal what he'd discovered. Now he retrieved the pouch from where he'd hidden it and placed it on the table. "This fell from Mr. Morse's saddlebag during his last visit," Russell said. "I believe the contents are quite interesting." Clayton's face went white. "That's my property. You had no right—" "Open it," Russell said to the marshal. Marshal Garrett opened the pouch and emptied its contents onto the table. Out fell several items: a tarnished silver watch, some coins, and a faded daguerreotype photograph in a cracked leather frame. The marshal picked up the photograph and held it to the lamplight. It showed a well-dressed couple, a man in a fine suit and a woman in an elegant dress with her hair done up in the fashion of 6 or 7 years ago. Between them sat a small girl, perhaps 3 or 4 years old, with dark hair and large grey eyes. On the back of the photograph, in careful script, was written, "Elizabeth and Jonathan Carver, with daughter Sarah Catherine, Philadelphia, 1868. The room went dead silent. "Sarah Catherine," the marshal said slowly. "That's an unusual coincidence, Mr. Morse. Your niece shares the same first name as the child in this photograph." Clayton's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Russell felt his heart pounding. He'd suspected something was wrong, but this changed everything. "That is Sarah," he said, his voice hard. "I'd stake my life on it. Those are her eyes, her face. Which means these people, the Carvers, they're her real family." "That don't prove nothing," Clayton said desperately. "Lots of children look similar." "Then explain why you have their photograph," the marshal demanded. "And explain this." He'd found something else in the pouch, a folded newspaper clipping, yellowed with age. He spread it on the table and read aloud, "Wealthy Philadelphia family offers substantial reward for information regarding their daughter, Sarah Catherine Carver, age 4, who disappeared from their home in June 1868. The child has distinctive grey eyes and a birthmark on her left shoulder blade. Anyone with information should contact—" "Let me see that," Russell said, his voice shaking. He took the clipping and read it himself, then looked at the marshal. "Sarah has a birthmark on her left shoulder. I've seen it while helping her wash. It's shaped like a crescent moon." The marshal's face had gone granite hard. He turned to Clayton with his hand on his revolver. "Mr. Morse, I think you'd better start explaining yourself, and you'd better do it truthfully." Clayton looked like a cornered animal. His eyes darted between the marshal and Russell, calculating his chances of escape. Finally, his shoulders sagged. "It wasn't supposed to go like this," he said, his voice flat. My associates and I, we took wealthy children for ransom. It was supposed to be quick. Get the money, return the child, no one gets hurt. But something went wrong," the marshal said. "The Carvers didn't pay," Clayton said bitterly. "They contacted the authorities instead. We had to move the girl, keep her hidden. One of my partners panicked, killed the people who'd been keeping her, made it look like a wagon accident. After that, it was too hot. We couldn't return her, couldn't ask for ransom again. So I kept her, figured I'd wait until things cooled down, maybe try again later. and when she became paralyzed. Russell asked, his voice dangerous. Clayton wouldn't meet his eyes. That was an accident. She fell during a move. Hurt her back. After that, she wasn't worth the trouble anymore. Couldn't use her for ransom. What family wants damaged goods? Couldn't sell her to the people who buy children for... He stopped, seeming to realize he'd said too much. The marshal grabbed Clayton by the collar and yanked him to his feet. You're under arrest for kidnapping, conspiracy to commit murder, and about a dozen other charges I'm going to enjoy writing up. He looked at his companion, Clayton's hired man, who'd gone pale and was holding his hands up in surrender. You too. Both of you are going to jail, and then you're going to tell me everything about your operation. Every child you took, every family you terrorized, every person involved. As the marshal secured Clayton and his companion with rope, Russell stood staring at the photograph of the Carvers, Sarah's real parents. Her family who'd been searching for her for years, who'd lost her to violence and greed. Mr. Parker, the marshal said once Clayton was secured, it appears you've been harboring a kidnapping victim. But given the circumstances, and given that you clearly didn't know, I'm inclined to overlook that. In fact, you may have just broken open a case that's been cold for years. What happens to Sarah now? Russell asked, though he dreaded the answer. I'll need to contact the Carvers, the marshal said. Let them know their daughter has been found. They'll want to come get her, I imagine. Take her home where she belongs, where she belongs. The words hit Russell like a physical blow. Of course she belonged with her real parents, with people who could give her everything he couldn't, proper medical care, education, a real home, a real future. But the thought of losing her, of watching her disappear from his life after these months of learning to be a father again, was almost unbearable. I understand, he said quietly. But Marshall, when you contact them, tell them she's been cared for. Tell them she's safe and healthy, and that she knows she's loved. Tell them that much at least. The marshal's stern expression softened slightly. I'll tell them, Mr. Parker, and I'll make sure they know what you did for her, how you saved her when no one else would. As they prepared to leave, taking Clayton and his companion to face justice, Russell stood alone in his cabin and tried to prepare himself for what came next. He'd found Sarah, he'd saved her. He'd given her months of safety and care, but now he'd have to let her go. Russell rode through the night to reach Thornhill, driven by the need to see Sarah, to be the one to tell her what they'd discovered. The marshal and his prisoners had gone a different route, heading directly to the nearest territorial office, but they'd agreed to give Russell a few days before contacting the Carvers. A few days to prepare Sarah, to help her understand that her world was about to change again. He arrived at the trading post just after dawn, exhausted and heart-heavy. Samuel met him at the door, took one look at his face, and simply nodded. That bad? Samuel asked quietly. Worse and better, Russell said. Is she awake? Just stirring. Martha's making breakfast. Samuel paused. What did you find out? Russell told him everything. About Clayton's confession, about the kidnapping, about the Carvers in Philadelphia, still searching for their lost daughter. Samuel's weathered face grew grave as he listened. Lord have mercy, he said when Russell finished. That poor child. And those poor parents, all these years not knowing. He looked at Russell with sympathy. And you having to give her up just when you've gotten used to having her. She deserves to be with her real family, Russell said, though the words felt like glass in his throat. They can give her everything I can't. Doctors who might help her walk again, education, a proper home, a real future. You've given her something they couldn't, Samuel said. You gave her love when she had none. You made her feel valued when the world said she was worthless. That's not nothing, Russell. Russell nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He went inside to find Sarah sitting by the fire, Martha helping her brush her hair. When Sarah saw him, her face lit up with such joy that it nearly broke him. You came back, she said. I knew you would, but I was still worried. Russell crossed to her and knelt down. I'll always come back to you, Sarah, always. He took a breath. But we need to talk. I found out some things, important things, about who you are and where you came from. Martha excused herself quietly, giving them privacy. Sarah's expression grew serious, her grey eyes searching Russell's face. "What things?" she asked. As gently as he could, Russel told her. He started with Clayton's arrest, explained about the kidnapping ring, about how she'd been taken from her real parents when she was just 4 years old. He showed her the photograph, watched as she studied the faces of the well-dressed couple. "These people," she said slowly, touching the image. "These are my real mama and papa." "They are," Russel confirmed. "Elizabeth and Jonathan Carver. They live in Philadelphia, and they've been searching for you for years. They never stopped looking." Sarah was quiet for a long time, staring at the photograph. Then she looked up at Russel with tears in her eyes. "But I don't remember them. I don't remember anything before Uncle Clayton, before living in the wagon, before the shed, before any of it. They're strangers." "I know," Russel said, his heart breaking. "But Sarah, they're your family. Your real family. They loved you before you were taken, and they never gave up hope of finding you. What if they don't want me anymore?" Sarah whispered. "I'm different now. I can't walk. They'll want you," Russel said firmly. "I'd stake everything I own on that. You're their daughter. That doesn't change just because you were hurt. Will you come with me?" Sarah asked, gripping his hand tightly. "When I meet them?" "Please, Russel, I can't do this alone." "Of course I'll come with you," Russel promised. "I'll be there every step of the way." The telegraph responses began arriving over the next few days. The first came from the territorial office, confirming they'd contacted the Carvers and that the family was making immediate arrangements to travel to Montana. The second came from the Carvers themselves, a brief message that Samuel read aloud with a shaking voice. "Our prayers answered. Coming immediately. Arriving Thornhill approximately 10 days. Please care for our Sarah until then. We'll be forever grateful. 10 days. Russel had 10 days to prepare Sarah, to prepare himself, to figure out how to let go of the child who'd become his whole world. He moved into Thornhill for that time, staying in Samuel's back room so he could be near Sarah. They spent the days together, talking, playing music, working on her reading. Russel taught her everything he could think of that might help her, how to be brave, how to trust, how to believe in herself even when the world seemed overwhelming. He also began preparing something special for her, a wooden box, carved with care from a piece of cherry wood Samuel had in his stores. He worked on it in the evenings after Sarah went to sleep, carving intricate designs into the lid, mountains and pine trees, a cabin in a meadow, birds in flight. Inside, he fitted compartments lined with soft cloth. "What's that for?" Samuel asked one night, watching Russel work. "Memories," Russel said simply. "Things she can take with her. Things that'll remind her she survived, that she's strong, that she was loved." When the box was finished, Russel began filling it. He placed the tin whistle inside first, wrapped carefully in cloth. Then the wooden doll he'd given her that first night, the doll that had been Emma's. He added the blue ribbon he'd found in her hair that rainy day at the trading post, faded but precious. He wrote letters, one to Sarah herself, to be read when she was older, explaining everything that had happened and how much she'd meant to him. Another to the Carvers, telling them about Sarah's time with him, her progress, her fears, her strengths. He tore pages from his journal, the entries about Sarah, about their time together, and carefully copied them into a smaller book that would fit in the box. He wanted her to have a record of these months, proof that this time had been real, that she'd been cherished. Martha contributed too, sewing Sarah several new dresses in better fabric than the rough homespun she'd been wearing. Samuel added a child's Bible, with Sarah's name inscribed on the cover. Even the other people in Thornhill, hearing the story, brought small gifts, a hair comb, a warm shawl, a book of fairy tales. As the days passed, Russel watched Sarah struggle with her own emotions. She was excited at the prospect of having parents again, of belonging to a family that wanted her. But she was also terrified of leaving the only security she'd known in years, of losing Russel, of facing another change when she'd already endured so many. "What if I forget you?" she asked him one night as he tucked her into bed at the trading post. "You won't forget me," Russel assured her. "We'll write letters. We'll stay connected. Just because you're with your real family doesn't mean I stop being part of your life. Promise?" she asked, her voice small. "I promise," Russell said, though he had no idea if he could keep that promise. Philadelphia was a world away from Montana. The Carvers were wealthy, educated people who might not want a rough mountain man in their daughter's life. But he'd promised Sarah anything if it gave her comfort. On the 8th day, Russell took Sarah back to the cabin one last time. He'd arranged it with Samuel, wanting to give her a chance to say goodbye to the place that had been her home. They spent the day there, Sarah moving through the rooms in her wheelchair, touching things, remembering. She sat in Emma's rocking chair by the fire and played the tin whistle while Russell pretended to be busy with chores. She examined his tools, his traplines, the rough furniture he'd made. She looked at everything like she was memorizing it, storing the memories away for later. "I was happy here," she said, as evening fell. "For the first time since my real parents, since the Carvers, I was happy. You made me feel like I mattered." "You do matter," Russell said. "You always have. You always will." That night, they slept in the cabin one last time, Sarah in her floor bed, Russell in his chair by the fire, both of them awake more than asleep, both dreading and anticipating what the next days would bring. In the morning, they returned to Thornhill. The Carvers would arrive in 2 more days, according to the latest telegraph. 2 more days of this borrowed time, this gift of fatherhood that Russell had never expected to receive again. He spent those final days teaching Sarah one last lesson: how to let people love her, how to trust that the Carvers' love was real, even though she didn't remember it, how to be brave enough to accept the life she deserved. "They're going to have so many questions," Sarah said nervously. "What if I can't answer them? What if I'm not what they remember?" "You're their daughter," Russell said. "That's all that matters. You don't have to be perfect, Sarah. You don't have to remember everything. You just have to be yourself, this brave, smart, strong girl you've become. That's enough. That's more than enough." On the morning of the 10th day, Samuel came to find them at breakfast. His expression was gentle but serious. "They're here," he said quietly. "The Carvers just arrived. Their coach is outside." Russell felt his heart seize. Sarah went pale, her hand gripping the tin whistle she'd been holding so tightly that her knuckles went white. "I can't do this," she whispered. "Russell, I can't." "Yes, you can," he said, kneeling beside her wheelchair. "You're the bravest person I know, Sarah. You survived things that would have broken most people. You can survive this too. And I'll be right beside you the whole time." He looked into her eyes, those storm-grey eyes that had first captured his heart in the rain outside this very trading post. And he saw the fear there, but also the strength. She was Emma's age now, the age his daughter had been when she died. But Sarah wasn't Emma, and this wasn't an ending, it was a beginning. "Ready?" he asked gently. Sarah took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and nodded. "Ready!" Together they went to meet the people who'd been searching for her for 6 long years. Together they faced the future that would tear them apart and perhaps find a way to keep them connected. Together, because that was what family did, even when family was about to change forever. Russell pushed Sarah's wheelchair toward the door, the wooden box with its precious cargo tucked safely in her lap, and prepared to give her away to the people who deserved her most. The coach that sat outside Samuel's trading post was unlike anything Russell had seen in these mountains. Polished black lacquer with brass fittings, pulled by 4 matched horses that looked like they'd never known a hard day's work. A driver sat atop, and beside the coach stood a man and woman who could only be the Carvers. Jonathan Carver was tall and well-built, perhaps in his early 40s, with dark hair graying at the temples. He wore a fine wool coat and polished boots, the kind of clothes that spoke of wealth, but also of taste. His face was lined with years of worry, but his eyes, sharp and intelligent, were fixed on the trading post door with an intensity that was almost painful to witness. Elizabeth Carver stood beside her husband, one hand clutched at his arm as if she needed the support to remain standing. She was elegant even in travel clothes, with dark hair swept up beneath a proper hat. But it was her expression that struck Russell most, the desperate hope mixed with fear, the way her free hand pressed against her heart as if to hold it in place. Russell pushed Sarah's wheelchair through the door and out onto the porch. The moment Elizabeth saw her, she made a sound, something between a gasp and a sob, and her knees buckled. Jonathan caught her, held her upright, but his own face had gone white as snow. "Sarah," Elizabeth whispered. Then louder, breaking free from her husband and rushing forward, "Sarah!" "Oh my God, Sarah!" She fell to her knees in the mud beside the wheelchair, heedless of her fine dress, and reached out with trembling hands to touch Sarah's face. Tears streamed down her cheeks unchecked as she traced her daughter's features with gentle fingers, as if confirming she was real. "It's you," she breathed. "It's really you. Your eyes, I'd know your eyes anywhere. Oh, my darling girl, my precious girl. We feared." She couldn't finish, overcome with emotion. Jonathan came forward more slowly, his own eyes wet with tears. He knelt beside his wife and simply stared at Sarah, drinking in the sight of her like a man dying of thirst. Sarah sat frozen in her wheelchair, the wooden box clutched in her lap, her face pale and uncertain. She looked at these strangers who claimed to be her parents, and Russell could see the confusion and fear in her eyes. She didn't remember them. To her, they were just well-dressed people crying over her, and it frightened her. "Sarah," Russell said quietly, keeping his hand on her shoulder for reassurance. "These are your parents, Elizabeth and Jonathan Carver. They've been looking for you since you were taken." "I don't remember," Sarah said, her voice small and apologetic. "I'm sorry I don't remember you." "It's all right," Jonathan said, his voice thick with emotion. "You were so young. We don't expect you to remember. But we remember you, sweetheart. We've remembered you every single day for 6 years. Elizabeth reached out slowly, giving Sarah time to pull away if she wanted to, and touched the girl's hand. "You had a birthmark on your shoulder," she said, "shaped like a crescent moon. You used to say it was where an angel kissed you. Is it still there?" Sarah nodded slowly. "It's still there." Elizabeth let out another sob and clutched Sarah's hand. "We never stopped searching, never stopped hoping. There were times when people told us to accept that you were gone, that we'd never find you, but we couldn't. A parent never stops loving their child, never stops looking, no matter how much time passes." Russell felt his own throat tighten. He understood that love, that desperate refusal to give up. He'd felt it with Emma, though he'd had no power to save her. The Carvers had been given a miracle. Their daughter returned to them, and he wouldn't let his own grief tarnish that gift. "Mr. Parker," Jonathan said, standing and extending his hand. "I cannot begin to express our gratitude. The marshal sent us a telegram explaining what you did, how you found Sarah, cared for her, protected her. You saved our daughter's life." Russell shook his hand, noting the strength in the man's grip despite his obvious emotional state. "I did what anyone should have done. She needed help, and I was there to give it. But you were the only one who did," Elizabeth said, rising as well, though she kept one hand on Sarah's wheelchair, as if afraid the girl might vanish if she let go. "The marshal told us she'd been abandoned, that people turned away from her. But you didn't. You took her into your home, into your life." She paused, studying his face. "He also told us about your daughter." "About Emma. I'm so sorry for your loss." Russell nodded, unable to speak for a moment. When he found his voice, it was rough with emotion. "Sarah reminded me what it meant to be a father. She gave me back something I thought I'd lost forever. Then we owe you more than gratitude," Jonathan said. "We owe you everything." They stood there in the morning light, the wealthy couple from Philadelphia, the rough mountain man, and the child who connected them all. Around them, people from the trading post had gathered to witness the reunion. Samuel and Martha among them, all of them moved by the scene unfolding before them. Sarah looked between her birth parents and Russell, her expression confused and overwhelmed. The wooden box sat in her lap like an anchor, something solid to hold on to while her world shifted beneath her once again. "I don't know what to do," she said quietly, her voice breaking. "I don't know who I'm supposed to be." Elizabeth knelt again beside the wheelchair and took both of Sarah's hands in hers. "You don't have to know right now, darling. You don't have to be anyone except exactly who you are. Her voice cracked, "we just want to know you again, to love you again. Will you let us try?" Sarah looked at Elizabeth's hopeful, tear-stained face, then at Jonathan, standing protectively nearby, then finally at Russell. In her eyes, Russell saw the question she couldn't ask aloud. "What do you want me to do? What's the right choice?" He knelt beside her wheelchair, bringing himself to her level. "Sarah," he said gently, "these people are your family. They loved you before you were taken, and they never stopped loving you. They can give you things I never could, a proper home, medical care, education. They can give you the life you deserve. But what about you?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "What about our cabin and the mountains and—" She clutched the wooden box tighter, "and everything we built together." "That doesn't go away," Russell said, though his heart was breaking. "That's yours to keep forever in here." He touched her chest gently over her heart. "No one can take that from you. But Sarah, you have a chance now, a chance to have everything. Parents who love you, a real home, a future full of possibilities. I won't let you give that up for my sake." "We don't want to take her from you," Elizabeth said quickly, looking at Russell with understanding. The Marshal explained, "You've been her father these past months. That bond, that love, it's real and it's precious. We would never ask her to choose between us." Jonathan stepped forward. "Mr. Parker, we live in Philadelphia. We have resources, connections. Our home has been modified over the years for, well, we had hoped Sarah might return, so we prepared for her needs. We have doctors who specialize in treating paralysis, new treatments being developed. But," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "but we also understand that Sarah has built a life here, with you. We wouldn't dream of severing that connection." "What are you saying?" Russell asked, afraid to hope. "We're saying that while Sarah's home is with us, you'll always be welcome in her life," Elizabeth said. "We'll write to you, send photographs. When Sarah is old enough and strong enough, we'll arrange visits. And if you ever wanted to come to Philadelphia—" "I appreciate the offer," Russell said, "but I'm a mountain man. I don't belong in a city. But letters," his voice caught, "letters I can manage. And knowing Sarah is safe, loved, given every chance to thrive, that's enough for me." Sarah was crying now, silent tears streaming down her face. "I don't want to lose you," she said to Russell. You're my papa too." The word hit Russell like a physical blow. Papa. Emma had called him that. And now Sarah, this child he'd found in the rain, this girl who taught him that love could survive even the deepest grief, called him the same name. "You won't lose me," he managed to say. "I'm right here, Sarah. I'll always be right here, in your heart, in your memories. And I'll be here in these mountains, waiting for your letters, proud of every single thing you accomplish." He reached for the wooden box in her lap and opened it carefully. One by one, he showed her what he'd placed inside. The tin whistle, the doll, the blue ribbon, the journal pages, the letters. "This is for you," he said. "Everything in here is a piece of our time together. When you're in Philadelphia, when you're learning new things and meeting new people, you can open this box and remember. Remember that you survived. Remember that you're strong. Remember that you were loved here, in these mountains, by an old man who didn't know how much he needed you until he found you." Sarah threw her arms around his neck and sobbed against his shoulder. Russell held her close, breathing in the scent of her hair, memorizing the weight of her small body, storing up this moment because he knew it was ending. All things ended eventually, but the love remained. Elizabeth and Jonathan gave them that time, standing back respectfully, their own tears flowing freely. Martha had come out from the trading post and was weeping into Samuel's shoulder. Even the rough trappers and settlers watching had removed their hats, moved by the scene. After a long while, Sarah pulled back and looked at Russell with red-rimmed eyes. "I'll write you every week," she promised. "I'll tell you everything, about the doctors, about Philadelphia, about learning new things. And I'll practice the tin whistle, and I'll take care of the doll, and "I know you will," Russell said, cupping her face gently. "You're going to do wonderful things, Sarah. You're going to have a life full of love and opportunity. That's what I want for you. That's what I've always wanted." He stood slowly and turned to the carvers. "She's special," he said. "She's been through more than any child should have to endure, but she's strong, stronger than she knows. She learns quickly, she's got a good heart, and she deserves every happiness you can give her. "We know," Jonathan said. "And we promise you, Mr. Parker, we'll spend the rest of our lives making up for the years she lost. She'll want for nothing, including connection to you. There's one more thing," Russell said. He reached into his coat and pulled out a silver pocket watch that Samuel had helped him purchase. A simple but well-made timepiece with an engraving on the back that read, "For Papa Russell, who taught me I was worth saving. With love, Sarah." He pressed it into Jonathan's hand. "This is from Sarah," he said quietly. "She wanted you to have it. A reminder that she's grateful for everything, that she loves you both, but also that—" He had to stop, clear his throat. "Also that the time we spent together mattered." Jonathan looked at the watch, read the inscription, and then without warning pulled Russell into an embrace. "Thank you," he said, his voice breaking. "Thank you for saving our daughter. Thank you for loving her when she had no one else. You gave us back tomorrow." When they finally separated, Elizabeth had composed herself enough to speak practically. "We should go inside," she said. "Give Sarah time to adjust. Let us all talk more calmly. Mr. Parker, will you join us? We have so many questions about Sarah's time with you, things we want to know, things she might not remember to tell us." Russell nodded and followed them inside, pushing Sarah's wheelchair one last time, savoring these final moments of being her protector, her papa, her everything. 3 years later, the autumn colors painted the mountains in gold and crimson once again. Russel Parker stood on the porch of his cabin, watching the aspens shimmer in the afternoon light, and thought about how much had changed, while so much remained the same. The cabin was still his sanctuary, still the place he called home. But it was different now, warmer somehow, less lonely even in his solitude. Emma's rocking chair still sat by the fire, but he no longer avoided looking at it. The memories it held were precious rather than painful, reminders of love that had shaped him into the man he'd become. On the table inside lay a bundle of letters, tied with a faded blue ribbon. 73 letters in total, one arriving faithfully each week from Philadelphia, sometimes more. Russell knew them all by heart, had read each one so many times the paper had grown soft at the creases. Sarah's letters told of a life transformed. The Carvers had spared no expense in seeking treatment for her paralysis. She'd seen specialists, undergone therapies, worked with doctors who used new techniques from Europe. And slowly, miraculously, she'd begun to regain sensation in her legs. She couldn't walk yet, might never walk fully, but she could stand with support now, could move her toes, could feel when someone touched her feet. But the letters weren't just about medical progress. They were full of life, descriptions of her school, where she was excelling in music and mathematics, stories about her parents, about trips to the theater and museums, about birthday parties and new friends. She wrote about the servants who'd grown to love her, about her room full of books and musical instruments, about the garden, where she spent hours watching birds, just like she'd done at the cabin. And always, always she wrote about missing him, about remembering the mountains, the quiet mornings, the tin whistle lessons, the way Russell had made her feel safe when she'd had nothing and no one. Russell wrote back faithfully, his letters shorter but no less heartfelt. He told her about the seasons changing, about the animals he encountered, about improvements he'd made to the cabin. He sent her pressed wildflowers from the meadow, feathers from the ravens she'd loved watching, small carved figures of mountain animals. He told her stories about his traplines and the weather, but mostly he told her he was proud of her, that he thought of her every day, that she remained in his heart no matter the distance between them. The Carvers had visited once, bringing Sarah back to Montana for 2 weeks during the summer after her first year in Philadelphia. It had been bittersweet, seeing how much she'd changed, how healthy and vibrant she'd become, while knowing she'd returned to a world that was no longer his. But Sarah had been overjoyed to be back in the mountains, had insisted on going to the cabin despite the difficult journey, had wanted to see everything exactly as she remembered it. They'd played the tin whistle together by the fire. She'd sat in Emma's rocking chair and told him about Philadelphia, about her life, about her hopes and dreams. The Carvers had been gracious and kind, treating Russell with respect and genuine affection. They understood what he'd given up, understood the sacrifice inherent in letting Sarah go, and they made sure he knew he'd always be part of her life. But Russell hadn't left the mountains to visit Philadelphia. He'd been invited repeatedly, but something held him back. Perhaps it was fear of not fitting into that world, of being out of place among the wealth and refinement. Or perhaps it was simpler than that. Perhaps he knew that his role in Sarah's life was to be her mountain, her solid ground, the constant she could return to when everything else changed. And mountains didn't travel. Now, as he stood watching the sunset paint the peaks in shades of purple and gold, Russell thought about the letter that had arrived just that morning. It was different from the others, thicker, written on fancier paper, and it came with an enclosed train ticket and a formal invitation. Sarah was turning 10 years old. The Carvers were hosting a celebration, and they weren't just inviting Russell, they were insisting he come. Sarah had written the invitation herself, in careful script that showed how much her education had progressed. "Dear Papa Russell, please come to my birthday. I need you here. I want to show you everything, introduce you to everyone, prove to them all that I have two families who love me. Please say yes. Your daughter, Sarah Catherine, two families. Your daughter." The words had moved him to tears when he first read them. He'd been wrestling with the decision for a week now, torn between his reluctance to leave the mountains and his desire to see Sarah, to be part of this milestone in her life. But as he watched the sun sink below the peaks, as the first stars began to appear in the deepening sky, Russell realized the decision had already been made. Sarah had been brave enough to leave everything she knew when she went to Philadelphia. She'd been brave enough to embrace a new life, new parents, new possibilities. The least he could do was be brave enough to face a city, to step outside his comfort for a few days, to show her that love meant showing up even when it was hard. He went inside and began to pack. Not much. A change of clothes, his good shirt, the pocket watch Jonathan had given him after that first meeting. The watch had an inscription now, added by the Carvers, "For the man who gave us back tomorrow, tomorrow." That's what Sarah represented. Not just for the Carvers, but for Russell himself. She'd given him back his tomorrow, his reason to keep living beyond mere survival. She'd reminded him that love didn't die with loss, that hearts could heal even when they'd been shattered, that family could be found in the most unexpected places. As he closed up the cabin, banking the fire and securing the windows, Russell looked around at the space that had been his refuge for so long. It would be here when he returned, solid and unchanging. But he wouldn't be unchanged. This journey to Philadelphia, this step into Sarah's new world, would transform him, just as finding her in the rain had transformed him 3 years ago. He thought about Emma as he rode toward Thornhill the next morning, heading for the train that would carry him east. He thought about Catherine and the family he'd lost, but he didn't think about them with pain anymore. He thought about them with gratitude, for the love they'd given him, for the lessons they'd taught him, for the man they'd helped him become. That man had been broken enough to run away to the mountains, but he'd also been whole enough to see a child in need and choose to help. He'd been wounded enough to understand suffering, but healed enough to offer comfort. He'd been lost enough to appreciate being found. The mountains stood eternal behind him as he rode. They'd be there when he returned, just as they'd been there when he arrived 15 years ago, seeking escape. But now he wasn't running away. He was running toward Sarah, toward connection, toward a future that honored both his past and his present. Some moments change everything. Finding Sarah in the rain had been one of those moments. And now, heading east to celebrate the life of the girl he'd saved, Russell understood the full truth. She hadn't just survived because of him. He'd survived because of her. And in the end, that was enough. More than enough, it was everything.